Hello everyone, thank you and welcome. Thanks for joining us for the Centre for Emotional Health Annual Mental Health Conference. So the Centre hosts one of these public lectures each year in October as part of Mental Health Month. And with yesterday being World Mental Health Day, this is the perfect time to be discussing mental health during the teenage years. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, the Wadawurrung clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the Dreamtime. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So Ron Rapee will be giving our public lecture today. He's a distinguished professor in the Department of Psychology here at Macquarie University and is the founding director of the Centre for Emotional Health. Over the past 25 years, Ron has published extensively on understanding and managing emotional difficulties across all stages of life, from preschoolers all the way through to older age. He's published over 270 scientific papers and has written and edited books for professionals, parents and the general public. He serves on several editorial boards and acts as a consultant to a number of government, non-government and scientific bodies. Ron has received a number of awards for his scientific contributions. In 2009, he was awarded the Distinguished Contribution to Science from the Australian Psychological Society. He was awarded the title of Distinguished Professor at Macquarie University in 2010 for his outstanding contribution to research and practices in clinical psychology. He's a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and in 2012 he was made Member of the Order of Australia for his contributions to clinical psychology. In 2015, Ron was awarded a prestigious Australian Research Council Laureate Fellowship to conduct research into the development of emotional functioning during adolescence, focusing on understanding factors that increase and decrease the risk of developing mental health problems during the teenage years. And I believe a number of you here are part of the RAW project. So you probably met Justin at the sign-in desk, who you've all spoken with on the phone. So he'll be joining us shortly. So we're very honoured to have Ron here with us tonight to present on the turbulent teenage years, mental health and resilience. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ron Rapee.
Thank you. Now I was going to, can people hear that? Yeah, I don't know if this is actually working, but I can talk anyway. I was going to wander around, but I'm not sure I could actually make it flip over, so I might have to stay here anyway. But thank you. I believe that, in fact, all of you are part of the RAW project, and if that's true, thank you. Thank you very much, and I believe I can see some people who are actually part of the RAW project here as well, which is even better, so thanks, guys. That's really, really great. What I want to do, well, let me start out with this. This wasn't really supposed to be my cover slide, but it's a good one to begin with, that we all... How does one move this thing? I hope this will do. And I think parents go into parenting, and Carly's a great example here, standing there introducing me as about to launch on this the journey of parenthood. People go into parenthood with this great dream of parenting, don't we? This wonderful, happy family, smiling. You all went in with that idea, didn't you? That was the purpose. And then somewhere along the line, something kind of changes a little bit. And those of you who've got older kids will know this very well. Those of you who have got just the RAW cohort might recognise the eye rolling at least, if nothing else. It's coming, it's coming. And you can't give it back, Carly, at this point. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the adolescent period, talk a bit about the research and the knowledge that's been done by people about what happens during those teenage years, what are the sorts of changes that kids go through during that time that might lead to some of these ups and downs during that time. And then towards the end, and I may run out of time, but towards the end I want to talk a little bit about mental health in teenagers, and then towards the very end I will hopefully have some time just to start to give you a little bit of a flavour of some of our very earliest, not findings really so much at this stage, Justin. This is Justin, everyone. You all know. Not so much findings at this stage, it's too early, but just some idea of who's in the cohort and what sorts of kids we have, what sorts of families, and some of those sorts of things, and a couple of little hints of findings. So hopefully we'll get through all that, and hopefully if we do, there will be time for questions at the end. We'll see how we go. All right. So, what's adolescence? Adolescence, well, we all know what adolescence is to an extent, but I guess we forget that adolescence is sort of, it's really a sort of a cultural concept. There's no biological thing that is adolescence, and it varies from culture to culture. In Western cultures, we typically think of 13 to 17 as the adolescent years. We call that adolescence or teenage, but different cultures have different periods. And different cultures have different expectations of when what a young person needs to do at different stages of their life, when they can get married, when they can have families and things like that. So it's a cultural definition in some ways, but typically we think of it as 13 to 17, and it coincides broadly with this idea of puberty, but not entirely. So puberty actually starts a little bit before the teenage years and ends before the end of what we would normally call the teenage years. Generally with puberty we'll be thinking, and it's quite a broad onset, but puberty begins about a year earlier in girls than in boys, and it varies somewhere around about 11, 12-ish on average for girls, and around 12, 13 on average for boys, but it varies a little bit, and varies quite widely. So what are the things that change during the adolescent years? What changes do we see? Well, first of all, of course, we see a lot of physical changes. Like this little guy, you see the barnacles growing on kids. There's obvious physical changes, and that's the stuff that we, as a society, often pin on to say, they're going through puberty because of the physical changes. But that's not all there is. So we see, for example, first of all, sexual changes, growing of breasts and testes and penis size and pubic hair. You also see non-sexual physical changes, so things like other sorts of hair, the barnacles, the skin eruptions, pimples, other body hair, and growth which occurs in spurts typically. So it's not linear, but growth occurs at certain phases. What you don't see is also brain changes. So the brain itself also changes quite dramatically during the teenage years, and those changes seem to be very clearly linked to the hormonal changes that occur with puberty. And so you get all sorts of subtle and not so much subtle changes in both in the brain structure, so in the actual physical brain itself changes, but also in the functioning of the brain. So there are certain functional changes that occur. And those brain changes underpin a lot of the things that we then see and we interact with in terms of teenagehood, particularly some of those emotional changes, perspective taking, things like that. So in addition to the physical changes, you also get a lot of psychosocial changes, and that's of more interest to us in the raw team. I'll introduce the raw team later. More interest to us, and it's a bit more interest usually to parents and to our society. What are the psychosocial types of things that happen when kids reach those teenage years? So the way that most developmental researchers think of the teenage years, you can put the changes, the psychosocial changes, probably best summarised under about 4 different broad headings or broad types of changes. So first of all, you get a dramatic increase in emotional experience. And I'll talk about each of these in a bit more detail later, but you get an increase in emotional experience, and that's something which anyone who's got a teenager or is even those early years that kids are now going into teenage, you will have noticed, I'm sure, those emotional changes that occur. You also get an increase in the salience or the importance of social relationships. So probably one of the most characteristics, or the classic characteristics of the teenage years, is that friends become far more important. They are the be-all and end-all of life. You also get, along with the emotional changes, you get a gradual learning by kids of how to manage those emotions. So they start to get better at controlling their emotions, better at managing their emotions. But that takes time. And I'll show you a bit of a schematic about that in a sec. And then finally you get this sort of general sense of who am I? This general idea of a self-concept and a gradually emerging self-concept across the teenage years and right up into the 20s. And part of that is it involves the friendships and the exploration with friendships, but part of that is also underpins the risk-taking that occurs in adolescence, because risk-taking is a great way to work out your boundaries and work out who you are by taking crazy risks, and you work out, well, can I do that or not? And so that's all part of that component of teenage years. So let's talk about teenage, start off with the emotional changes. I'll go through some of these changes that occur. I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with that, with the idea that teenagers are moody. There's no question about it, and that is partly a biological, hormonal underpinning. There are biological reasons for that, as well as social, psychological reasons. What you tend to find in research, when you give kids a particular cue, so if you get, let's say I did an experiment and I brought in a bunch of preteen children, a group of teenagers and a group of adults, and I flash up something emotional, either positive, a happy sort of picture, or a sad picture, and I hook them up to measure their brain waves, I would see that the actual emotional reaction is bigger in the teenage group than in either of the other groups. So that physical reaction, the actual emotional reaction, is bigger in teenagers to both positive and negative cues, but more so to negative. So when things go wrong, teenagers actually react more than either adults or children. What you tend to find is that bigger reaction occurs to anything negative, but it happens even more so when that negative thing has something social to do with it. So if you flash up a picture of an angry kid, their age, there's a bigger reaction than if you flash up a picture of a growling dog or something like that. So it's the social cues, that negative social cues are particularly stimulating for teenagers, and they can't help it. There is a basic, fundamental emotional reaction that occurs. In theory, one of the popular theories amongst researchers about what happens during the teenage years is something like this. If you look at the top, and I spent hours designing this, if you look at the top curved line, that's you can think of that as sort of like the accelerator in a car. That is the emotional reaction I was just talking about, the extent to which kids react to emotional cues. And you can see that what changes over time is, oh, that's no good. That might be better. What changes over time in childhood, from childhood to adolescence, is in that early adolescent period a dramatic increase in that emotional reactivity. And that is hormonally driven. That is brain changes, that is actually brain driven, but the brain changes occur because of hormonal changes. So the hormonal changes in puberty change the nature of the brain in such a way that that emotional reactivity takes off dramatically. And there's a massive increase in emotional reactivity in those early teenage years. Along the way, you've got this dark line down the bottom, which is the ability to regulate emotion, which we all have. Something goes wrong in our lives, we learn to cope with that, and we deal with that, and we keep our emotions in check. That ability to keep your emotions in check increases over the teenage years, but it increases very slowly and very gradually. And it continues to increase right up into the mid to late 20s. So by the time you get to the mid to late 20s, emotions are in check. You've got emotional reactivity and you've got an ability to balance that, but that's not happening until the 20s. And believe me, I've got an 18-year-old daughter. That's not happening until the 20s. Or at least I hope it is. I hope it's going to kick in. So in those early years, what you've got is this mismatch between an emotional reactivity and no ability yet, or very limited ability yet, to control that. And that's the emotional volatility you see in teenage years. All right. The big thing in the teenage years is friendships and peer relationships. And peer relationships are the major, in many ways, the major underpinning of the changes in teenage. So peer relationships become much more important from those early childhood years where their entire universe is the parents and the family. As they get into teenage, that universe kind of crumbles and falls apart, and it's replaced by the universe of peer relationships and friends. So what you tend to find is that teenagers, the older they get, the further into teenage, the more time they want to spend with their friends, and subsequently, of course, the less time they spend or want to spend with parents. Peer relationships can be both good and bad, as we all know. There's nothing wrong with peer relationships. It's fabulous. The peer relationships are what helps the development into the future, and peer relationships are crucially important and are wonderful for their development. They can also have negative impacts. We know that kids will drift towards other kids of similar type. So we know that kids who've got any sort of difficulties or problems will often tend to have other friends who've got similar difficulties and problems. By the same token, kids who are really high functioning and doing really well will often have friends who are high functioning really well. So you tend to find, and then in turn those friendships also feed back and magnify or increase the child's own natural way of being. So you tend to find sort of a feedback loop often between an individual child and their friendships, whereby they'll often drift towards similar kids, and those similar kids will then help to magnify what it is about them, good or bad. And of course we know that certain types of friendships then can also have negative impacts, and particularly in terms of negative mental health issues, things like peer rejection, cyberbullying, general peer bullying, things like that can all have very negative impacts on the mental health. Just as a somewhat random thing, I just thought I found this result, and I thought, this might be interesting to people. This is a survey done by Mission Australia every year. You've probably heard of it, the Mission Australia Teen Survey. They do it every single year. And this is the results on who they turn to. They ask them, who do you turn to when you've got a problem? Who do you look to for help? And the number one is friends. So teenagers will say, if I've got a problem, the first person I talk to is my friends. But on the positive side, well, for you guys, the positive side is that very, very much the same is also parents. So it's not like parents are replaced. It's not like parents are not turned to or not important in the teenager's life. On the contrary, parents are extremely important and continue to be. But whereas in the child years, parents are the only important thing, relatively, in the teenage years, you've got to share that space. So what does that mean? Basically, as we were just saying, mum and dad are okay. Mum and dad still are important in the teenager's life. And so what you find is that, I mentioned earlier, one of the characteristics of teenage is the idea of building a sort of a self-concept, an idea of who I am. And part of building that self-concept requires teenagers to turn their backs on the family to a degree. That's part of working out who I am, is to say I'm not my family, I'm different. And so part of that exploration, part of that, the difficulties in families and the arguments you get with teenagers, etc., is a good thing. That's part of kids learning who they are, and part of kids learning about their self-concept and building that self-concept. So what you tend to find is that the teenagers will start to pull away more from family as they go through the teenage years. There is a demonstrated increase in arguments across the teenage years in families. So if you find that there are more arguments happening in your family as your child goes into teenage, you're not alone. It's normal and it's expected. That's research after research shows that if you measure arguments in families, there's an increase in the number of arguments as kids go into teenage years. That's what they do. They're trying to become different. And they also spend less time with parents and less time with their family and more time with their friends. They also start to develop more of their own ideas, and so what we tend to find, or what the research tends to show, is that the best adjusted families, or the families that tend to have the least difficulties, occur when the parents get to a stage where they start to accept their child as a unique other. So you don't want to do that too early, of course, because they're not, but what you tend to find across time is an increase in arguments over time as the kids get older, and then you find a tipping point where those arguments get less, and that typically coincides with families saying, my child is another human being in this house, and they have a valid point of view, and they have a perspective to play in our house. And when the family starts to get that sense of them being almost like an equal or equivalent, then the arguments tend to go down. So while there's friction, arguments will increase. When that friction decreases and they're accepted as equals, then the arguments decrease. And that happens over time with maturity. In general, I'm often asked about parenting and how do we handle our kids, what's the best method of parenting? And my very broad answer would be to say there is no best method. The research on parenting in general doesn't tend to show much effects of parenting, sorry. But it doesn't really tend to show that different, except for the extremes, of course. If those parents who are abusing children or neglecting them, rejecting them, of course, they can have tremendous negative outcomes, really horrific outcomes in the longer term. But in the broad middle spectrum, it doesn't make a huge impact about parenting, except that overall there's a very small effect for what's referred to as authoritarian parenting, which is not as nasty as it sounds. Basically, authoritarian parenting refers to parents who set very clear rules, expectations and boundaries, and then do that within a real concept of love and caring. So it's made clear, so it's not in a negative way, but it's made just very clear. So basically kids know exactly what's expected and what's not expected. And families that have those sorts of relationships, warm love and caring and closeness, together with very clear rules and boundaries, seem to have kids who have the best sorts of outcomes, the highest levels of well-being at the end of the day. But having said that, there's a huge but, which is, can you imagine trying to parent a child who's always argumentative or always depressed and miserable or always worried? It's hard to do. Can you imagine trying to parent a child who's really high functioning and doing fabulously at school and fabulously with friends, etc.? It's very easy to do. So what we know is that authoritarian parenting goes along with kids who do well, but we don't know which way it goes. It may well be that kids who do well just allow much more warm, close, caring parents. So I can't say that's going to cause your child to do better, but that's what's been shown in the research. They go together. There'll be time at the end for questions, so it's probably easier if I keep going, and then if you have questions, I'll try and get more time. Okay, a couple of characteristics, other characteristics. Oh, a few little groans at this one. Okay, this is classic teenage behaviour. Kids don't want to go to bed. Do you guys? No one wants to go to bed when they're a teenager. And again, that is partly a hormonal-driven and brain change function. What you tend to find is that when kids go into the pubertal period, and I say pubertal period broadly because there's massive changes and it's a very broad period. When kids go into that sort of phase, there is a shift to what's referred to in the research literature as eveningness, which is that they start to have, it's like a sort of a jet lag shift. They basically start to shift their body clock in such a way that they don't feel as tired at bedtime and they're tired in the mornings. Their body clock just shifts around. And that happens pretty much in most teenagers. It's just one of those things that happens with teenage. They're not necessarily being naughty when they say that, but of course then it can in turn cause all sorts of cascading effects, and families don't want that to happen, and you have arguments or whatever, or you force them to go to bed or not. So as a result, what you do tend to find, because there's a shift, and because during the weekdays all kids have to get up for the dreaded school, you tend to find that most teenagers in our society tend to be short of sleep, chronically short of sleep. It's just one of those findings, and I'll show you some results on that right about now. So here's some results from a couple of surveys, one huge one in Europe and a smaller Australian one, looking at the number of hours that kids sleep, teenagers sleep during the weekday, along with the hours that they should be sleeping. So first of all, should be, there's a line there, about 9.2 hours has been sort of, on average, worked out. And this is average, so every kid has individual sleep needs, there's differences between everyone, so this is just average. But on average, the research suggests that you get the best performance, that is the best concentration, the best ability to solve problems, the best ability to deal with difficulties and emotional issues, whatever. The best performance occurs when teenagers have about average 9.2 hours of sleep per night. When the surveys were done about how much sleep kids got across these countries, there's not a single country anywhere in the world where kids are getting the sleep they're supposed to be getting. Interestingly, in the Australian survey, they asked the kids, how long would you like to sleep for? If you could sleep as long as you wanted during the week, when would you go to bed, when would you get up, how long? And the answer came up about 9.2. So kids know what they want. They know they should sleep and they want to sleep for longer, but they don't during the week, and that's because they're shifting, they're going to bed later, and then school, the alarm bell goes and they've got to get up for school and off they go. So they're short of sleep. So in the Australian study, less than 20% of kids in that particular study got their optimal, their 9 hours or more of sleep. I shouldn't have showed you this. I was going to ask you. They asked the question of kids. I can still ask you the question. So so less than 20% of the Australian sample actually went to bed because their parents told them to. And so why do you think, what was the biggest number? So they asked the question of the kids, when you go to bed, why do you go to bed? And what was the answer? What was the biggest, most common reason kids went to bed, or so they got to bed? Well, close, close, but not in this study, but close. No, it was done a few years ago, so maybe it's changed now. Very similar though. So, child turns off the Wi-Fi, yeah, turns off the lights, yeah, the TV. It's the TV, or show, no, it could be online, but they said the answer was, in the study anyway, why do you go to bed when you do? Most of the kids said, that's when my show finishes. So that's not surprising, makes sense, but that's, kids are determined. So what determines bedtime is not because I'm tired, not because mum and dad tell me to, not because I should get up in the morning, but that's when my show finished, so well, may as well go now. There has been research showing also along those lines that there's a clear link between screen time and sleep. So the more screen time kids engage in, the less sleep they get. Now again, we don't know which way that goes. It could be that being on screens forces kids to stay up longer, or it could be just if you can't sleep and you have insomnia, you watch the TV more. So it could go either way, but those two go together. And we do know that people, not just kids, people in general who get less sleep, that is associated, again, associated doesn't mean cause, associated with anxiety, depression, peer relationship problems, and so on. So that brings us on to the Wi-Fi. Hooked in teens. There was a survey of 14 to 17-year-olds back 5 years ago now. So this is way out of date already, so, unless this stuff changes. But just to give an idea of what kids in Australia are doing, a few years ago anyway, 70% of kids 14 to 17 had a smartphone. 60% of them said they used their phone to access the internet, and over 70% say they're going online more than once a day. And the popular sites at that time were Facebook, YouTube, Facebook and YouTube were the two. Now we know they've been overtaken by others, and we'll show you data from the raw group as to what your kids are using. And the main purpose is when they're asked about, in that survey in 2013, why do you go on the internet? It's primarily for entertainment, and secondly for communication, to keep up with my friends. For some reason, study didn't come in there. I don't know. I'm surprised at that, but I thought that would have been number one. So the question then that's always asked, and that comes up in the popular media, is the evil of the internet. It's such a terrible thing, internet's bad. And so the question is the internet bad? And broadly speaking, the research says probably not. It depends, and there are aspects of the internet that are connected with difficulties and mental health problems. Many aspects are not. In general, broadly speaking, when people do study after study after study, often sort of trying to show how bad the internet is, not much comes out. So in general, the internet is not a terrible thing. Obviously, there are some negative aspects, like I was saying before. Screen time is linked to lack of sleep, so there's those spin-off effects. But in and of itself, the internet is not broadly connected with negative mental health. But it depends, and there are certain ways of using the internet that do seem to be connected with mental health, both positive and negative. In many ways, use of the internet is an extension of the real world. So kids who are popular at school tend to connect with friends online, and they're also popular online. Kids who are being bullied at school tend to be bullied online. Kids who are having trouble at school tend to have trouble online. So a lot of it is not anything terrible about the internet. It's a reflection of what goes on in the kid's life anyway. There are certainly a lot of positive benefits to the internet. So kids and adults, but teenagers will report getting a lot of support from the internet. There's a lot of evidence that, in fact, kids do better when they have good support online, when they have good connections online and they engage in frequent chat online with their friends, that in fact they do deal with stress better and with problems better. So they're just like offline. There's value in having support from friends, whether it's online or offline. They also get to explore things and learn new things. There's good things about it. But there are, of course, risks. The obvious ones that we all hear about are cyberbullying and peer exclusion. So those kids who are being picked on online, we now know there are some very major negative mental health implications of that. And in many ways the same as offline bullying, but in some ways it can be actually worse online because the internet is so pervasive. So kids who are bullied at school, we know have some really negative outcomes down the track. But they get bullied at school, then they come home and they have safety. Kids who are bullied online, they don't get that safety. They're getting it everywhere because online is there all the time. And every time they check their phone, every time they check the chat room, it's there in their face again. So in some ways, the cyberbullying has even some worse impacts, potential impacts than offline bullying. But one of the areas that does seem to be important is what's referred to as social comparison. So kids that tend to go online constantly to compare themselves with others, whether it's comparing with other kids or whether it's comparing with movie stars or gym junkies or whoever it might be. But kids that go on particularly for the purpose of trying to look at who can I be better, who's better than me, and who can I look up to, those kids tend to also be the kids who are more anxious, depressed, and have more peer relationship problems. Again, most of this we're talking is a relationship. We don't know which way it goes, but that's partly one of the things we want to look at in the RAW project. But there does seem to be a connection that making more of those comparisons online is associated, connected with more body image problems and so on. Okay, one of the great periods, one of the great aspects of teenage years is the risk-taking, drug use and so on. Kids will take risks, and as I said, to some extent, it's a good thing if parents think of that as a positive to some degree. You want kids taking risks during teenage. Think about your own teenage years. That's how you learn. That's how you become who you are. So taking risks is a good thing as long as it doesn't kill you. So there's a fine line there, and obviously we have to keep our kids safe and we have to make sure that they don't get into trouble. But beyond that, taking some risks is good because that's part of being a teenager. That's how you become an adult down the track. So teenagers do take more risks. In general, you find that risk-taking increases over the early teenage years up to around about the middle of teenage, and then it starts to tail off and starts to decline a little bit. Again, friendships are important. So you find that risk-taking is going to be much, much more common with friends than without friends. I'm going to show you a study in a sec, which is my favourite study of all time. I love this study. And so in general, you tend to find that where people get into trouble, where kids get into trouble, it's a combination of, I mentioned earlier that that inhibition that grows, that inhibition doesn't kick in until the late, sort of mid-20s. So that inhibition is low, connected with the importance of friends. And if friends are pushing them, that's their world. And so that importance of being pushed by your friends and not having the ability to inhibit, that's when risk-taking tends to get out of control. So let me show you this great study. So this wonderful study these guys did. And what they did was they looked at risky driving in teenagers. And they had three groups. They had a group who was older, so an adult group, average around about 35 years of age. They varied a bit. They had a young adult group who were sort of around 20-ish. And then they had a nice teenage group around 13 to 16, 14, 15 years of age. And they got them all to do a driving simulator task. So it was on a computer, they had a simulator, and they got them to do a driving where there was I can't remember the detail, but it was some sort of task where you got points for how many risks you took. It was sort of like there was a push to take risks. You got more points for being fast and taking risks and cutting through traffic, but of course there was also the chance that you would crash and burn, and that was the end of your game. So it was this thing where kids had to learn to balance, or people had to balance the risk-taking with the points you got and whether you do it well or not. And they did it, each of them did it under two conditions. They did it once when they were by themselves, and they did it once when they had another group of the same age, other people in the study, were with them in the room, just watching them, not saying anything, and they didn't know them, they weren't friends, just people of your same age just standing there watching. And the results were absolutely fabulous. So, when they were by themselves, so below the line was the way they scored it. Below the line means they drove safely, above the line means they drove riskily. They took too many risks. And so you can see that overall, teenagers are taking more risks than adults, but not much, not a lot of difference when they're by themselves. And they're all safe. The teenagers were driving broadly, basically safely when they were by themselves. When the peer was in the room with them, or peers were in the room with them, that was the difference. Dramatic effect. So having the peers there suddenly made the teenagers go absolutely crazy. You can see even the adults didn't drive quite as safely, but not much of an effect for adults. Lovely, lovely study. Anyway, so I think it nicely illustrates the risk-taking, and particularly the risk-taking in the presence of peers. I just thought I'd show you, along the lines of risk-taking, some data from Australia. This is the most recent I could find on substance use. This is a 2012 publication, a 2011 study by the Department of Health and Ageing on substance use amongst teenagers. It is what it is. I was going to say it's alarming. It's not alarming, or I don't know. No, it's sort of a bit of both. So what they've got there is those kids the number of kids who say they've ever used a particular substance, and the number of kids who use it in the past week. Now, we don't know, of course, the past week whether that means it was just an accident. They happened to pick them up the one time in their life they ever used it. But the chances are that past week is probably those kids who are using regularly. So that's the alarming bit. The top bit, you're finding about half the kids have tried alcohol sometime in their life, as young as 12, 13. Yeah, I mean, some people in the audience might say that's horrible, some people might say, so what? It varies. That's very individual views about all that. And once you get to 16, 17, you're finding almost all kids have tried alcohol. Many of them have tried cigarettes. But the more important findings, the worrying findings, are the past use, which is probably the kids who are using regularly or frequently. And you're seeing as many as 10% of kids as young as 12 or 13 are using alcohol regularly. And that is a concern, of course. And by the time they get to 16, 17, about half the kids in this room, by the time they get to 16, 17, will probably be using alcohol regularly. Now, past week doesn't mean they're alcoholics. That means they go to parties and they drink when they go to parties, or something like that in most cases. Okay, so summarising. Oh, gee, I better hurry. All right, teen years are great. What time did I start? 6. Oh, okay, whoops. All right, teen years are great. They're a fabulous time of life. It's a time when you learn, when you grow, when you're creative. It's great. There can also be difficulties, as we've been saying. It's a time of emotional turmoil, of peer relationship pressures, studying pressures, and so on. So that then brings me to talking just very quickly and briefly about teenagers and mental health. And given the time, I'll try and go through this moderately fast, so you've got time for some questions. Back to the Mission Australia survey. They asked the kids in this survey, what are you worried about? And the number one, or the top few concerns that the teenagers reported were all about mental health stuff. So you can see coping with stress, study problems, school and study problems, body image is one of the biggest ones, depression. Teenagers in our society are worried about these issues. It's on their mind. They are thinking about negative mental health types of issues. So, how many kids do have actual disorders? So if we're looking at actual clinical mental disorders, this is a big survey, a national survey in Australia, a national survey of mental health and well-being, done in 2015. Oh yes, sorry, this is the kids one, not the adult one. So the kids one was done in 2015, and these are the disorders. So this is across the board. You tend to find about 7, so yeah, about, where are we? It hasn't got everything. It's around about 10% of young people will have a mental disorder, a clinical mental disorder in a given 12-month period. And you can see the most common there is anxiety problems, followed by ADHD, and then depression and conduct problems, least so. You get some slight differences between girls and boys. So boys much more likely to have ADHD and conduct problems. Girls are more likely to have anxiety and depression. So how do you know if your teenager has anxiety or depression issues? Anxiety problems are the same as any anxiety, they're just more frequent or more intense. So it's the same as experiencing anxiety for anyone. The characteristics of anxiety and the characteristics of anxiety problems include kids who worry a lot about things. They're constantly talking about worries on their mind and thinking about bad things happening. The hallmark of anxiety is avoidance behaviour. So these kids don't do things that they're afraid of. They tend to, and that's the biggest issue with anxiety, is they start to restrict their lives because they're worrying so much about things, and so they stop doing things. They stop going to activities, they stop going to school, they stop having sleepovers, and so on. Often physical symptoms go along with that: headaches, stomach aches, physical tension. And the key question that you need to be asking if you're worried about your child with anxiety, the key question is it affecting my child's life? So the question being, how do I know it is normal anxiety or extreme anxiety? The question is really about, is it affecting my child's life? If it's stopping them from achieving their potential, if it's stopping them from getting somewhere in their life or from doing what they need to do, then it's worth doing something about it. It doesn't matter whether it's clinical, not clinical. That's pretty arbitrary. It's a question of, if it's affecting my child's life, why not do something about it? There are several ways in which anxiety will manifest, several common types of anxiety, and the most common ones are these. So social anxiety refers to kids who are very worried about what other people think. They get very shy and they have trouble talking to people, they have trouble making friends, meeting new people, speaking up in groups, and so on. Separation anxiety refers to kids who don't want to separate from an attachment figure, so most commonly mum or dad, and so they won't leave them. And they often don't want to go to school, they don't want to have sleepovers, they don't want to go to school camps, etc. And it's because of an anxiety. So it's not because they're being naughty, it's because they're saying, I'm scared. Most commonly they say something like, I'm scared that when I'm away from mum, she's going to be killed in a car accident, or she'll be attacked by a burglar, or something like that. And as a result of that, I'll never see her again, etc. So they're worrying, it's an anxiety, they're worrying about what will happen when they're separated. Generalised anxiety are the worry warts of our world. So they're the kids who worry about all sorts of things. They worry about starving kids in Bosnia. Kids starve in Bosnia? I'm not sure, but anyway. They worry about starving kids somewhere. They worry about the sun blowing up. They worry about their family's health. They worry about relationships and friends. They just worry about all sorts of different things. And that worry, again, the issue is that it affects their lives. It starts to overtake their lives, stops them from sleeping in many cases, it stops them from doing a lot of things, stops them from concentrating and being able to perform well. And finally, obsessive compulsive disorder is actually no longer technically an anxiety disorder, but it still is. And so that refers to kids who tend to have very, very repetitive stereotype patterns. They do things over and over and over again in the same way, or they have thoughts that go over and over in their heads. And again, it's anxiety-based. So the thoughts are things along the lines of something terrible will happen. And then the behaviours they do are along the lines of, if I don't do this, then something terrible will happen. For example, if I don't wash my hands 100 times a certain way, then I'll get sick and I'll die. If I don't put all my pens in a certain line, then my mum will be in a car accident and she'll die. So it's those, I have to do these things in a certain rigid way, otherwise something terrible will happen, is the nature of obsessive compulsive problems. Okay, depression refers to kids then who are just who regularly report being very, very down, very sad, very miserable. Along with that, they often have trouble sleeping, sleep much less than normal. They're often very tired, lethargic. They lack interest in things. They don't engage very well with people or with activities. And you might say, well, that's a teenager. That's any teenager. So we're talking here about, again, about that sort of behaviour happening much more than normally would. So these kids are really very low in energy, and it needs to be repeated and consistent over at least 2, 3, in most cases it'll be over several months, but at least 2 or 3 weeks would be the minimum time for it to be considered a clinical problem. So kids waking up and being miserable for a day or two, kids breaking up with their girlfriend or boyfriend and being miserable for a week, that's normal sadness. We're talking about extremes of sadness, lethargy, loss of interest that continues on and on for at least a couple of weeks or more. And that interferes with life, as with all mental disorders. Some of the impacts, I think I'll go through this pretty quickly, but anxiety and depression can interfere with a whole range of different things: school attendance, making friends. Kids who are anxious and depressed are often bullied and teased by others more than other kids. Family problems, physical health. And ultimately, it increases the risk for suicide. And I just wanted to briefly mention suicide because people often ask about that. So suicide in young people does occur, and it's tragic and horrific when it does, and so we do need to be aware of it, we do need to think about it. But it's important to point out it's rare. It is very rare to actually have a completed suicide. So the figures suggest about 11 per 100,000 young people. So the actual completed suicide doesn't happen terribly often. What you do find much more often is suicidal thoughts. So a lot of kids will talk about considering suicide, or the idea of I'm flirting with it, or I wonder what it would be like if I didn't exist. Those sorts of thoughts. A lot of those sorts of thoughts are very normal. And if you hear your child talking about that, it's not a time to necessarily get alarmed. A lot of kids entertain those thoughts and they're transient and they go away. Where you hear your child talking about that repeatedly, that's when you need to take it seriously and you need to think about it. So the most important thing is to talk about it, to ask about it, and to keep the conversation open, because you're looking for it to happen more than a few times. Kids thinking occasionally about, oh, wonder what it would be like just never to be here again or something. That's scary for a parent to hear, but it's very normal. That's part of that teenage development. It's the consistency and going on about that you need to look out for. So the key issues with suicide is if a child does talk about it, you need to take it seriously. It's important not to sweep it under the carpet. Very important to open the conversation and just treat it like part of any other conversation and just ask them about it. Explore with them. Let them tell you about it. Don't let them feel embarrassed or stigmatised by it. The important thing for parents to remember is that talking about suicide is not going to give them ideas. Talking about how to kill yourself, talking about whether you'd kill yourself, talking about what would happen if you killed yourself, those things they've already thought about. They've already talked about it on the internet. They've talked about it with their friends. It's not giving them any ideas. So what we find with some parents is this idea of, oh, they mentioned it, so I just don't want to talk about it because I don't want to give them new ideas. That doesn't happen. Much more important to talk about it, because then you know what's going on and they know that there's someone there they can talk to if they want to. So don't sweep it under the carpet. What you do want to find out about is practicalities, just common sense stuff. If a child talks about suicide and if it sounds like they might actually be a little bit serious about it, then just asking, well, how would you do it? When would you do it? Where would you do it? Those practical issues. Because that's what you're looking for if, and hopefully and almost certainly it won't happen to anyone here and hopefully it won't, but if a child was to say, well, I know that I can get these drugs from here and I know that I can, I was thinking that I'd go to the bridge down by the river, whatever it is, and do X, Y, and Z, then that's very serious. And then you do need to get help instantly. So that's what you're looking for, that concrete stuff that they have in their mind. The more vague they are about it, the less immediate the risk. Still worth taking it seriously, but there's less immediate risk. Okay, so positive news, anxiety and depression can be treated, and they can be treated very effectively. We've got good treatments. In brief, both medications, as a class of drugs that they're referred to as the antidepressants, but they work for anxiety as well, so they're technically called the SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and other sorts of related drugs. They work, and they work well for anxiety as well as depression, and they have consistent effects. And also therapy, in particular cognitive behaviour therapy, is the type of therapy that has been shown to work. Doesn't mean it's the only thing that works, but that's the one that's been shown to work consistently. In general, when you look across studies, you tend to find around about 50%, about 40 to 60% of kids who go through a proper course of SSRIs or a proper course of cognitive behaviour therapy will be completely recovered at the end of treatment. Of the other 50%, most of them will also be better. Still, there's only a small percentage who don't change at all, but maybe not completely recovered. But about 50% will be completely recovered. So we have pretty good treatments, and they work reasonably well. The benefits of psychological therapy over drugs is mainly that psychological therapy, CBT, teaches skills, and those skills stay with you. So we tend to find in the longer term that kids who've been through CBT tend to stay better, whereas on medication, of course, once you stop the medication, you don't always have a relapse. In some cases it's gone, but in many cases you will find that kids will slip back, or people will slip back once they stop medication. There's also programs now, CBT programs online. So there's a variety of places where you can go online. You can find good and scientifically tested programs, CBT programs that teach practical skills, and they can be done from the comfort of your own lounge room or wherever you want to do it. Okay, that brings me on just very quickly to talk about the Raw project, and many of the team are sitting down here. So that's our Raw. Well, we don't always have drinks in our hands, so probably I should change I should change that picture, shouldn't I? But that's most of the team except for Justin, who wasn't there on that day, and he doesn't drink. So, as I said, I think everyone, or most people here, are in the Raw project, and we're really grateful and thrilled that you've volunteered your time and the time of your kids to be in this project. What we're wanting to do, the whole purpose of the study, is to have a look at some of the things that I've been talking about today, to try to get a better handle on what are the things about teenage that increase the risk for mental health problems, or the opposite, increase the chances that kids will do well and have high functioning well-being. So we're looking at the factors that increase both negatives and positives across development in young people. So we started with kids in Year 6, and we're planning to follow them. So we started, as you all know, last year when kids were in Year 6, and we're now following, this year we're doing the second year, and we're continuing to follow up. At the moment we have funding for at least 3 waves, and I think probably 4, so I've got enough money to test 4 times. And then we're really hopeful that we'll be able to get more money down the track to continue to test, because that's when the fun starts. That's when the interesting, in 4 years, 4 waves is when we start to get the really interesting bits. So we're hoping that we can keep testing and test at least, hopefully, right through the teenage years would be ideal. As you all know, we're looking at, there's 3 broad types of measures. You're all filling out questionnaires. We've also got the interviews, which are the more clinical aspect of the interviewing, and then we have laboratory tasks where the kids are doing all sorts of fun things, aren't you? fun things for 3 short hours. It's 2 hours. Oh, 2 hours. Nothing. All right, so who have we got? We've got, we were aiming for 500 families, and Justin and the team we were all sweating pretty much early on in the early days when things were a bit slow, and these guys worked incredibly hard, worked their butts off to get promotion, and so we've ended up with 528 families, which is absolutely fabulous, and thank you again. It's wonderful involvement. The average age of the kids, of course, the first time was about 11. And you can see it's a convenient sample. So on average, we've got a biased sample towards a more educated, more higher functioning group. That's who you get typically in university trials, unless you make a real effort to look elsewhere, which we didn't for this particular purpose. Just a few facts and figures. Tash is interested in body size. So just to give you an idea of weight amongst the kids, the majority of kids, of course, are in the healthy weight range. We've got about 20%, about 1 in 5, who are overweight, and about 5%, 6% who are underweight. So we get some range there where we can start to look at what impact weight might have on various development down the track. Sleep, at the moment, remember these kids, our data so far are for the first year, which was Year 6. So at the moment, kids are doing pretty well. 9 hours of sleep a night on average. Well done. Obviously, good sleep-filled kids. We'll see what happens this year and next year. So we're expecting, of course, that might change in the coming years. I think probably quite dramatically, but we'll see what happens. So at the moment, about 9 hours on average. Social relationships, it varies. We've got some variations. So about 30% of kids are saying that they have been bullied at some stage in the school year. That's not unusual. It's a little higher than normal, but not particularly. We tend to find about 20–25% of kids will say that they've been bullied in a school year. Across a whole school year, there's a lot of opportunities for kids to pick on a kid for a while, get a little bit bullied, and then it stops. So that doesn't mean that we're talking about chronic, consistent, long-term bullying. We're talking about kids who say, sometime in the past year, I was bullied, and it's not unusual to have that sort of figure. Cyberbullying is much less common than the other forms of bullying, even though we get a lot of publicity about cyberbullying. In most of the surveys, you tend to find cyberbullying is actually quite rare, and it is in our sample, well, not surprising at this age as well, because they're still not on the internet quite as much as they will be down the track. But the most common form of bullying is what's called social exclusion, which is basically kids saying, I don't want to play with you, I don't want to be with you, I don't want to hang out with you. So that's the most common. And on the positive side, 80% of our kids are saying they've got great relationships, great friends, things are going really well at school. And 65% are talking about good school belonging. In other words, that means that they say, I love my school, school's great, school supports me, school's a good thing. And so that's fabulous. Use of technology, out of interest, 44% had their own mobile phone. That will increase, obviously, in the coming years. 22% had their own personal computer or laptop, and 45% had their own other device of some type. In terms of what they did, they say, this is the kids themselves, I think it's the kids reported, yeah, so the kids are saying they're spending about 30 minutes to an hour a day on television. Yeah. I think next year we might ask the parents about that. They're also saying they don't read magazines, never to rarely, which is pretty common in today's society. In my day, that would have been a lot higher, but yeah, magazines. That's why magazines, some of my family are in the media business, and they're going out of business rapidly. And people just don't read magazines much these days. So, social media use. 66% of our group so far say they have a social media account. I think if we ask the parents, that figure might be a little bit lower. Something you may not quite know. There might be some conversations tonight. And even though Facebook and I think most of the social media things say not until you're 13, 66% of 11-year-olds have got a social media account. Not surprising. And in fact, most of them have more than one social media account. This is what they're on. You can see that Instagram is now picked up. If you remember the data I showed you from 2013, Instagram didn't even rate. It's now number one, number two. So most of the kids are on Instagram. There's some differences there between girls and boys, not a lot. But in general, what you tend to find in this sample and in all samples typically is girls are much more on the visual types of things. Girls are doing more visual stuff. So girls are on the Instagram, the Pinterest, Snapchat, things like that. Boys are a bit more on the techie YouTube side of things. Mental health problems amongst the group we have so far. We have 19%, almost 20%, who were the parents reported that the kids had a history of some sort of treatment, of seeing someone. That could have been a counsellor, it could have been anyone, but had some sort of psychological treatment. And almost 30% of parents are reporting they themselves have had some sort of issue at some stage in their lives. In terms of the actual diagnosed problems that the kids are reporting, or kids and parents in the interviews, we're getting close to 18% with an anxiety disorder. Now, if you remember the data I showed you from the national survey, about 7% had an anxiety disorder, so we're getting a higher rate. That's not unexpected. We're an anxiety clinic, we're known for our work in anxiety. I think people are coming here partly out of interest of what their kids, what will unfold in their kids over time, and so it's not unexpected. And in many ways, in terms of from our selfish perspective, in terms of our research, that's a good thing, because we'd like to have some sort of levels we can see. If we had no one with any problems, we wouldn't see anything unfolding. So, look, it's. I think you're getting feedback. Anyone who's worried about these things has been getting feedback from our team, and so hopefully we'll get you some good help along the way. Mood disorders, on the other hand, are pretty much non-existent in our sample, and that also is not unexpected. What you tend to find in the research is that depression and mood disorders take off around about 13, 14. So at this age, 11 years of age, we wouldn't expect to see much depression, and we're not. But we may well start to see more coming up. Eating disorders as well. We're getting 0 eating disorders at the moment. But again, you tend to find eating disorders don't kick in till a little bit later. So we might start to see some things coming in later on. ADHD and oppositional, the other one is oppositional disorder. That's not uncommon. On the flip side, 80% of kids are saying they're happy with life, life's great, things are going well. So that's the good side. Our sample, by and large, are a satisfied bunch and a happy bunch, which is good. So if anyone does want to get any help down the track, they'll put up a few websites there that are particularly geared towards young people. A couple of them actually, well, young people and adults, but both. So the top couple, MindSpot and This Way Up, are actually sites that have online cognitive behaviour therapy programs. So you can do treatment programs through there, but they're geared more at adults. Headspace and Reach Out are geared very much towards young people. They are specifically young person focused. So they're good for teenagers. And then Beyond Blue has a range of possibilities. And then, of course, our own clinic here.